gonna get started. So, hello everyone, welcome back to Young Progressives Club. And today we will be hearing from Ian Kelly, who is going to be giving us a presentation on Lyndon B. Johnson.
So thank you, Daniel, for letting me give a presentation today. And so firstly, when you think about LBJ, what do you think about? Generally, when one thinks about LBJ, they generally think of one of three things, or at least this is what I think. People think about. You're probably thinking about either civil rights bill, Voting Rights Act, and the like, or the Vietnam War, or maybe even the Kennedy assassination. Now, is this a full and accurate representation of Lyndon Johnson's legacy? Well, in order to fully look into this, we not only need to look into his presidency, but his entire life to understand why he did certain things. So let's get into LBJ's life. So LBJ was born in 1908 in rural Texas, where there wasn't either running water or electricity in his home. And his father was a member of the state legislature, which provoked political aspirations and interests at a young age. He even told his classmates that he was one day going to be president. And I guess he was right. And so after graduating from high school, he briefly attended college where he, he didn't necessarily like it and all that. So he very quickly dropped out and moved to California, where he worked odd jobs and also worked at his, I don't know, I'm not going to get into that. But he, shortly thereafter, moved back to Texas, where he worked as a hard laborer, and he even got arrested later on for getting into fights. And he was at that point determined to refocus his life and strive for more. So he enrolled at Southwest Texas State Teachers College, which is in Southwest Texas. He excelled at journalism, government, and debate, but was otherwise a fairly mediocre student. And he did a strong job at student teaching, which ultimately got him a role as a student teacher at an impoverished Mexican-American school in Texas, in that town, which I'm not gonna even. I think it's Catella. I don't know. And where he worked to help himself financially provide for his education. And he later on said that working there was a tremendous experience because it showed him what poverty and what discrimination looks like, because he saw the terrible living conditions of the Mexican Americans, and he just saw the level of flagrant racism in the region. And so he, following college, briefly taught, but his political aspirations and political activism got in the way of that. So he very briefly afterwards quit from his position. And he was offered a position in a newly elected congressman's office upon the recommendation of his father, who, of course, was a member of the state legislature, so his name carried some weight. And he worked himself very, very hard in these positions. And he worked long, hard hours and was just generally he was worked to death from this almost. And the reason he did this is because since an early age, as you saw, when he was inspired, to say to others that he wanted to become president, essentially, he was determined to exercise power extremely well. And this is what he would learn, is that he learned how to exercise power and how to effectively do it. And he very much strongly aligned himself with the New Deal and the policies of Franklin Roosevelt. And after a few years, he moved on to become the Texas director of the National Youth Administration, which is sort of, at the time, was to help young people find work after perhaps they were unemployed or things like that. And he was actually recommended by the future Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. And after spending a few years there, he moved on to Congress, where his district representative died, and Lyndon Johnson very quickly jumped on the opportunity to be elected to the seat. And he was only 28 years old. And he continued to strongly align himself with the policies of the New Deal. And he, during his time in the House of Representatives, actually brought running water and electricity to his districts, something that he was not, expected, because it had just never been that way. And LBJ later on in his life said that that was the achievement he was most proud of in his political career. And Johnson's continued lust for power did not end here. And thus, he very shortly thereafter, being elected to Congress, decided to run for Senate after one of Texas's senators died. And for the longest time, he was the front runner, but he was also sharing that stage with the governor of Texas, W. Lee Pappy O'Daniel, who announced his run very late in the primary season. And fraudulent ballots at the time were extremely, extremely common. And essentially how they worked was that each county had a political boss, whether it be a county judge or things like that. And basically what both sides did extremely, to an extreme amount. But O'Daniel slightly cheated a little bit more and ultimately pulled through by about 1,300 votes. And Johnson was just felt cheated, slighted, and all that. But Johnson was undeterred, and he continued as a member of the House of Representatives to seek and exercise power, something that he had just been doing for the whole time. And LBJ had used his relationship with FDR to earn a naval commission, where he earned a Silver Star, despite only serving on one mission, which he made the qualification for because he served under hostile fire. And LBJ used his insider knowledge of the war effort to make substantial profits, and this later on caused him to be painted as a war profiteer by one of his future re-election opponents for the House of Representatives. And following World War II, many Americans felt somewhat weary of large government, largely due to the spread of communism in Eastern Europe and in Asia and things like that, which caused Lyndon Johnson to somewhat backtrack on his support of FDR's New Deal and progressive policies. But in 1948, he felt determined to become a United States Senator. But this time he ran against someone arguably even more popular than W. Lee, the Texas governor person. And he ran this time against Coke Stevenson, who, by the way, was nicknamed Mr. Texas, just to signify how beloved this guy was in his home state. And he was a staunch conservative and a staunch segregationist. And following Texas's finding of oil, Texas moved largely to the right on social and economic issues. And Johnson, determined to become a senator, refused to be portrayed as a FDR liberal. So he ran as an anti-union, anti-civil rights, pro-business Democrat, and he ultimately won by 87 votes. And this is absolutely with the involvement of voter fraud. And LBJ was determined to do it. And due to such a small winning margin, he ultimately earned the nickname Landslide Lyndon, which is a doozy right there. And once he became a United States Senator, had a very quick rise. He only in 2 years became the Senate Majority Whip. 4 years became the Senate Minority Leader since the Democrats lost the Senate. And then in 6 years became the Senate Majority Leader. And he was able to do this through strong personal relationships he developed, primarily with Richard Russell, a Democratic senator from Georgia. And due to these personal relationships and his deep knowledge of congressional procedure, he was able to exercise power extremely effectively, which allowed him to rise so quickly. And as Senate Majority Leader, LBJ was widely considered one of the most effective Senate Majority Leaders of all time. One of those people that think that is Robert A. Carroll, a historian who has spent his whole life covering Lyndon Johnson through his book series, which I will briefly mention later on. And LBJ used his deep knowledge of Senate procedure to, weasel his way into success. And one of the ways he did this is the clerk, who is the person who lists the names and tallies the votes. He'd quite frequently tell them to speed up the vote or slow it down to whichever way would benefit him in the position he wanted. And he ultimately realized there was a growing rift between the Northern liberals and the Southern conservatives within the Democratic Party. The Northern liberals quite frequently associated with John F. Kennedy at the point, and the Southern conservatives with Richard Russell, who we mentioned earlier. And Johnson really, let's admit it, really didn't have much policy. He wasn't an ideologue. He basically was an opportunistic politician and basically used the positions that he thought would give him success. And so this made him very much an appeaser. He tried to appease both the Northern liberals and the Southern conservatives at the same time, which led to much very ineffective legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which of course is not the one you remember. You remember the 64 one. And this is because the Civil Rights Act of 1957 is almost all talk, no action. A phrase politicians quite like to criticize others for all the time. And in 1960, LBJ viewed the natural next step for his political rise to be him running for president. And he did. And he had a very real chance of becoming the nominee, because at the time, conventions were not decided by the voters. They were decided by party insiders who then chose the delegates and who would ultimately become the nominee. And it was around this time that primaries started to come around. And he ultimately lost the nomination to John F. Kennedy, who is a Northern Catholic, which to many people in the South, because the South at the time had been strongly Democratic and had been the base of Democratic support, for the past several decades, since essentially the end of the Civil War. Kennedy realized he was not going to become president if he didn't have a Southerner on the ticket to balance him out. And he ultimately went for Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson really was not, he really thought that becoming vice president wouldn't be a very good move for him, because, quite frequently it's referred to as a do-nothing job, your heartbeat away, go to funerals. But he essentially viewed it as his last chance of ever becoming president, and well, he turned out to be right. But as vice president, he was largely a passive figure, didn't have much influence, much sway, and many in the administration just flat out did not respect him. They viewed him as a hick, and these people were primarily it was Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, the brother of the president, who thought that who thought that Johnson was unsophisticated, Southerner who grew up in a rural town, while Bobby Kennedy grew up in a elitist community in the Northeast. And the rift between the two was just massive. And he was not involved in the final decisions usually. That instead would go to Bobby Kennedy generally. And lots of people thought that Johnson would likely be dumped from the re-election ticket because he had served his purpose, which was to get JFK elected president in the beginning. But of course, JFK was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. And lots of people believe that LBJ was involved in the JFK assassination in one way or another to become president himself. And I'm not saying that that's not possible. I'm merely saying that there's been no evidence that has, proven that at all. And he always had been, for the entirety of his life, he was like, well, I don't want to be a footnote. I want to be a person that's important, and I want to be a person that will be remembered. This is why he, for the longest time, had such a lust for power. And so thus he was determined to have an extremely consequential presidency, which it very much was. And now we move on to LBJ as president of the United States. And first, let's focus on his domestic policy, which generally was composed of the Great Society. And the Great Society was essentially the second act to the New Deal. And LBJ viewed the New Deal as incomplete. Things it didn't cover was, first of all, while it did account for some economic inequalities, it did not focus for racial inequalities, and also did not provide for national health care. So Johnson thought that, he could pick up where the New Deal left off. And he continued for FDR's fight for economic equality, and he did this with the war on poverty. And he brought justice to disaffected groups such as minorities and others. And much of these programs still exist today: Medicare, Medicaid, and a lot of others, as you'll see in a moment. And they're quite frequently referred to as the welfare state. And so shortly after the Kennedy assassination was, of course, the 1964 presidential election. And Lyndon Johnson was terrified that he would be challenged by Bobby Kennedy for the Democratic nomination. So he slightly set up the Democratic nomination process at the convention to ensure LBJ's renomination. And essentially what he did is he ensured that Bobby Kennedy spoke after the nomination happened officially. So he would not be able to make his case for himself, as opposed to Johnson for the nominee, until after it could happen. So it was essentially inconceivable that can happen. And the Republicans ran Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who was considered by many to be a right-wing radical warmonger. And LBJ absolutely took advantage of this, quite famously taking the slogan "In your guts, he's nuts," which was a play on Barry Goldwater's slogan at the time: "In your heart, he's right." And Barry Goldwater actually, as a matter of fact, later on inspired Ronald Reagan to get into politics. And LBJ won over 61% of the vote. And to this day, this is still the largest popular vote margin in history. And now, look at this. These are all the major laws passed during the Lyndon Johnson presidency. And if you just look through here for a moment, you'll see progressive goals, urban mass transit, minimum wage increase, guaranteed student loans. Like, LBJ on the domestic front was an extremely progressive president. And now I want to focus in on 5 of these laws. And these are the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, Medicare and Medicaid. And the first 3 are essentially ensuring equities between the white and minority communities, whether it be through segregation, through voting rights, or through housing. And Medicare and Medicaid ensured that seniors and people of a lower economic status could have access to healthcare insurance. And all these are still law today, but the latter 2 have been modified with certain laws, other laws. And you can make the argument that Lyndon Johnson had the best congressional presidential relations in history. And this is largely because Johnson was a Senate man. He became the Senate Majority Leader, and he was able to exercise power very effectively in this manner. And on the right, he was giving the Johnson treatment, as it's been called, to Richard Russell, the person for the longest time had been somewhat of his political mentor. And he used his intimidating personal physique, strong personal relationships, inside knowledge of members' personal lives, and his deep knowledge of congressional procedure to get his way when it came to policy. But now let's focus on the much darker part of his legacy, and that's his foreign policy and the Vietnam War. And prior to Lyndon Johnson's presidency, Vietnam was the French colony, and that was occupied by the Japanese Empire during World War II. And Ho Chi Minh, who Daniel referred to last week in his Soviet perspective Cold War presentation, and he revolted initially against the Japanese, but later with the French for independence, and that became known as the First Indochina War. And at the time, American foreign policy revolved around the domino theory, which essentially says is letting a country fall to communism will just result in another country falling to communism, and it will just happen more and more and more. And at the time, the president was President Eisenhower, and he was very reluctant to get involved in this war, perhaps beyond financial support. And the 1954 Geneva Accords ended the First Indochina War and split the Vietnam into Communist North and Capitalist South. And essentially, the South rigged the election to prevent unification. And this led to the Second Indochina War, or the Vietnam War. And in the South, anti-government forces formed the Viet Cong, which was strongest in rural areas. And President Kennedy did not want to get involved and wanted the South to win on their own. But the South was very disorganized and was in a weak position, so he ultimately did get involved and ultimately couped the South. And this was very shortly before the Kennedy assassination. I think it was within maybe a month or so prior. And the goal was to replace it with a stronger ally, but instead it would destabilize the region more and actually strengthen the Viet Cong, or pro-communist forces in the South. Now, when Lyndon Johnson became president, he slightly changed the policy, and there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin that was essentially Johnson's justification to get much more military involved in the region. And from there, he had airstrikes. He put troops on the ground to defend U.S. military installations and South military installations. And the troops in Vietnam increased exponentially. And initially, the goal of the U.S. troops was to defend the South and not win the war. And he was convinced by military advisors that he could win the war. And you know, if the U.S. became more involved, it could win the war in the end. And the NLF in North Vietnam had a massive environmental advantage due to the forest, and they fought in a guerrilla manner to the disadvantage of the United States. And the public and the media sensed that the administration was not being transparent on the issue, so public confidence began to erode for the president. And in early 1968, there was this thing called the Tet Offensive, which was done by the North to try and conquer the South. And it ultimately failed, and the U.S. was able to counterattack very effectively. And this cost thousands and thousands of lives, and this just really began the massive erosion of support for the president. Just at the time, like, it went much more than it went before. And this caused him to only get 50% of the vote in the New Hampshire primaries this year, to 42% for Eugene McCarthy, who was a prominent critic of the Vietnam War. And in the end, he was still a favorite to win the nomination, but he realized he was in a weak position to win it. So as a result, he withdraws from the presidential race. And I accidentally skipped a slide. And he died about 4 years after leaving the presidency. And there is how he has fared with presidential historians over time. And well, I have to wrap this up quicker than I would have liked, but if there's any questions, briefly ask them, and if Daniel has anything to say, there he can say it.
What's the final verdict on LBJ then, briefly?
Oh, well, on the next slide, I said that basically on domestic policy, he had a strong record with his Great Society programs, but his foreign policy record was weaker because he was very interventionist in not only Southeast Asia, but in Central America as well.
Okay, I'm stopping